Hello everyone, Bruce Polk here with another Adventures in Great Symphonic Music. On this chat, we're going to complete the discussion that we started last time on Franz Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. And why was it unfinished? Well, that's what we're going to deal with. Is there a way to complete it? What do we have? Why didn't he finish the symphony? The first two movements were so innovative, so good. Why doesn't it go anywhere from there? Well, like I said last time, the third movement, which is a scherzo, which is what you would expect. You have the slow second movement, then you have a dance movement, a scherzo. And we have almost the entire opening part of the scherzo in full score, completed by Schubert. But then the middle section, called the trio, it just kind of peters out. Even you see in your handout, I give you the sketches for this this movement, the piano reduction of the sketches. So, and you'll see that as the movement, as the trio continues, it just less and less material, less and less harmony, just a couple notes here and there, and that's it. That's all we have. So why didn't he go on with this? One theory which I think we can dismiss, at this time Beethoven's influence on Schubert was very, very great, and Schubert was quite fond of Beethoven's, was it the Second Symphony? Let's see here, yeah. The Second Symphony, the scherzo to Beethoven's Second Symphony, there might be a couple, just a couple of, melodic ideas that are similar to the Beethoven Second Symphony, but they are so, in my opinion, inconsequential that I don't think Schubert would have said, "Oh, I'm just copying Beethoven's Second Symphony." No, you weren't. But some people thought that, and I really don't think so. So again, I think probably the best thing to do is to go ahead. Brian Newbold, who was a great Schubert scholar, did complete a version of this third movement. Let's listen to that. If you have a handout, you can follow it. And then we're going to hear some interesting stories that move forward from there. But first, here's what we have in the Brian Newbold completion of the scherzo to Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. We're in the key of D major, proper key for that in relation to the first two movements. Theme comes back. And develop a little bit. Back to the beginning, standard practice, repeat back. That's the main tune there, really. The first part was just introductory. And there's the return to the original material, varied. Now measure 41. Like Beethoven, it's a development section, not a new theme. Oh, and look at there, 55. Return to the main material, almost. '72. Modified return to the original theme, but it's still developed. Close to the original there, but in a different key. That's a measure 80. And now measure 112 is a closing. Measure 41. Measure 55. Bounce. 72. 81. Or 80. And 112. Trio, page 13. It's played twice. So in your handout, this section, less and less of the bass line. And here's the middle section of the trio. Again, melody, but no harmony notes. And that's all we got. So from here on is Brian Newbold making the best possible guess. And there's the 154. Back to measure 138, standard form. And there's the 154 section. Then, standard form, 170, back to the scherzo. There's like almost no changes. It's really just exactly the same as we heard before. Except it has an ending. It has started before too. So if you will allow me to, having heard this, fade out of it. So, this was, a perfectly good scherzo. Didn't seem to have quite the drama that the first two movements had. But again, Schubert never finished it. So we don't know where would he have gone. We honestly have no way of knowing. So, but now, in the words of, how shall we say it? In the words of Paul Harvey, and now the rest of the story. Okay, here's another part of the story. The 100th anniversary of Schubert's death. The Columbia Record Company sponsored an international competition for someone to complete Schubert's unfinished symphony. And they said, you may use the sketches we had for the third movement, the scherzo, and we have some ideas about what might have been the finale. You might choose to, follow that. Or if you wish, you may write something completely different. So, and the prize was incredible. What was the prize? It was an amazing, I think it was $10,000 or $20,000, which in the year, what would that be, 1928, that was a lot of money. However, several composers say, hey, look at, we think it's frightfully unfair for us to attempt to guess what Schubert would have done and try to write something in Schubert's style. Let's do it. And they got so many complaints that they find, okay, here's what we're going to do. I think it was a $20,000 prize. We're going to divide it in half. $10,000 for the best person who completes the Schubert unfinished, and another $10,000 for somebody who writes, a new version or a completely different piece. We don't care, just a new great piece. We'll have two prizes. Well, okay, that allowed people to do something that was not related to Schubert, or it could be. And the winner in the English zone was an English pianist by the name of Frank Merrick. And he wrote specifically a third and fourth movements for this symphony by Schubert, but not using any of Schubert's sketches. He created entirely new material, and I finally found a recording of it. In fact, I just listened to it for the first time. It came in the mail yesterday, so I've been listening to it as I was coming downtown, coming to record this lecture. And it's pretty good. The third movement is really good. Fourth movement, okay. But in any event, many people submitted versions. A lot of people wrote new music, then there was a prize for that as well. But Frank Merrick won the version to complete it. But there was another completion of this third movement. And it was done by the great conductor, Felix Weingartner. Weingartner was famous for trying to get back to the printed score. He thought that conductors in the 1880s through the 1920s and 30s, they were taking so many liberties in terms of tempo and changing things a lot. They said, oh, let's get back to what's written on the page. Well, you can argue on that both ways. I much, when you see something written on a musical page, like that, the analogy is Shakespeare wrote, did he write to be or not to be? No, he wrote T-O space B-A space O-R space N-O-T space T-O. Everything after what's written on the page is interpretation. And that's why you have Richard Burton, and you have all these great actors. You have Mel Brooks delivering that famous monologue. And each of them provides an interpretation which you can accept or dismiss, or it might give you new insights. So myself, I much like that interpretive freedom that was a part of the orchestral style from, well, we don't know how far back, there's recordings we have from the 1900s. And we see both things. We see some people that are pretty literal to the score, and we see other people, Mengelberg, Stokowski, Van Weinen, many other people that took much greater liberties. I prefer the one with greater liberties because it is an interpretive art, like a great dramatic actor delivering a line in what they think is an acceptable way. But nevertheless, Weingartner said, nah, let's get back to a little more, staying with what the composer wrote. Well, he had ideas about completing this symphony. And so he was moving ahead with that, but then this committee from Columbia Records, they had asked him to be one of the judges. Oops, oh well, that meant he could not therefore submit an entry because he was now a judge, that would be a conflict of interest. So he did make use of it. He incorporates it as the second movement of his Sixth Symphony. And he gives you, he orchestrates the piece a little bit from what you've heard and dramatically alters how he does the trio in the middle section, anticipating Anton Bruckner, but more about that. I wanted to hear Weingartner's ideas about this movement. Here it is, the Weingartner version of the Scherzo from the Schubert Unfinished Symphony. Starts out much the same, a little slower tempo. This is different. Just put it soft, that's all. Back to the beginning, very minor changes so far from what we have in Schubert's original manuscript. Here he just doesn't get loud, but it's the Schubert notes getting loud for the return of the main theme there. Now the middle section, again very similar. Now this is different. There's the equivalent of measure 54. Schubert had in this sketch. In fact, quite a bit of extension. Finally returning there. That's almost like a one, but not really. Now, that's the main repeat back. The trio. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, much slower. It's the Schubert sketch melody, but quite contrasting. With the repeat, second time through measure 122, even softer. Now the middle part of the trio. Yeah, this is pretty much new material that Weingartner is creating. And there's the trio part 1. Much more introspective than other. That whole section is a repeat of the middle portion of the trio, with again the return of the beginning of the trio, standard form. And then back to the scherzo. Well, I must say, I much prefer that version of the completion of the scherzo. It's much more interesting. The fact of a very, very slow tempo for the middle section, the trio, that was not common. You might slightly relax the tempo of the trio, and Beethoven does that sometimes, and sometimes the trio is in a different meter. If the scherzo is in triple, a few cases the trio is in duple time, like I think the Beethoven Ninth Symphony does that, if I remember right. But Weingartner is saying, and I think this is true, Schubert, in many ways sets the stage for the next generation after him, specifically the Austrian Anton Bruckner, a great organist of his time, another 9-composer symphony. Like Schubert, a bit of a shy man. People kept trying to champion him, and after Wagner died, they tried to make Bruckner the next, champion of the new school, and Bruckner just wasn't psychologically or socially set up to be that kind of a person. He was a rather humble fellow. Every one of his symphonies is dedicated to God, and he was happiest when playing the organ in the organ loft. He was a great composer and a great organist. And in his symphonies, the scherzos oftentimes, the middle section, sometimes it's a scherzo trio number 1, scherzo trio number 2, completely different material, scherzo again. So like Beethoven, he's elongating what could be in Mozart and Haydn very short movements. Beethoven tried to make these dance movements have more substance by being longer, and Beethoven does it just by playing them more often. Bruckner does that by adding new sections, and oftentimes the sections like this Weingartner version of this completion of the Schubert unfinished scherzo employs a different tempo, and it's lovely, absolutely lovely. Now, okay, what about the last movement? Well, at the time, we know that Schubert also was completing the incidental music to a play called Rosamunde. And in this Rosamunde music, there is an extensively long entr'acte, about 8 minutes long. An entr'acte is generally done in a stage play where you have to change scenes, change the scenery. So you put music in to cover the fact that they're moving the stuff around on the stage so that either the stage play or the opera or whatever can go on. That's the basic function of an entr'acte. So this is kind of long for an entr'acte. And amazingly enough, it's in B minor. It's the proper key for what would have been the Schubert Unfinished Symphony. But it just, it doesn't have any of the idea of completing the drama that we heard in the first 2 movements and arguably in the third movement as done by Weingartner. So it's interesting to me that it is a convenience to say that maybe the Schubert Rosamunde entr'acte was originally going to be the last movement of this B minor symphony. Well, we're going to hear a version of it that actually takes the entr'acte from Rosamunde and expands on it a little bit, makes it a little bit more exciting. And we're going to listen to that. But before we get to that, we have to discuss why didn't he finish this symphony? He lives, another few years, where are we with this symphony? Is it 1822? 1822 is when he began. He dies in 1830. So he lived another 8 years and wrote a complete symphony, the one we now know as the Great C Major Symphony, and several other works. So why not go back to this? Well, recent musical historian research has come up with a potential reason why this happened. And it deals with Schubert's relationships with his attempt to get married or whatever, because he never did marry. There seemed to be, according to Greenberg, who does all those great great DVD lectures for the teaching company, Robert Greenberg, fantastic. And on the Schubert Unfinished, he deals with the fact that we know that Schubert expressed interest really in a serious relationship with only 2 women. One we talked about briefly last time, that was Teresa Grob, who was the daughter of the silk manufacturer, and due to the laws that if you can't provide record of you being able to financially support a wife and a family, you wouldn't get married. He also, remember, he was teaching the 2 daughters of the Esterhazy family, who both played the piano. And the elder daughter, Caroline, was a beautiful woman, a little bit older than Schubert, maybe by just a couple of years. I think that's right. Is that right? I think so. And Greenberg said that she was tall, gorgeous, intelligent, and rich. Well, again, what hope would there be for an underemployed, kind of a half-time music teacher, kind of interesting composer, but not making any real money? So we know that he never really approached building a relationship further than that, but we do know he loved her and was fascinated by her. And if opportunities had come available, perhaps he might have attempted to pursue it, but it would be so unlikely that a woman who was at the top of a really major and powerful house would be willing to take on any kind of a serious relationship or a marriage with someone like Schubert. In our time, the great biographer Maynard Solomon, probably still today the best single-volume biography on Beethoven that you could get, and a very, very good biography on Mozart as well, very carefully researched. Solomon is the guy that finally told us who the Beethoven's immortal beloved was. He had letters to the immortal beloved, but Beethoven never identified that woman he was writing to. Solomon, through incredible historical research, actually has come up with a very likely candidate for who that was. So this is the guy, he's very, very careful about his research. Well, what Solomon suggests, he began to research this very question. Why did Schubert not complete the Eighth Symphony, and began to come out with some ideas. Basically what he says, that more than likely, Solomon said there's compelling evidence that Schubert was either bisexual or at least homosexual, with homosexual being his dominant sexual orientation. Well, okay. Of course, in this time in the world, that type of behavior was not really tolerated. So, it's just really hard to say where it's going to go from there. So, let's fill that in and talk a little more about it. So now we enter into this section where, what about that? We do know that Schubert contracted syphilis early in 1822. 25 years old he was. Most likely during one of his pleasure jaunts. Remember that friend from when he was in the convict school as a kid? The convict school sounds so bad, we think convict is bad. No, that was just what they called the schools. It was a really great school. But his friend Franz von Schober, who was the very wealthy fellow, who kept providing Schubert with blank manuscript paper, whatever he needed to complete his studies. And Schubert was a tall, according to Greenberg, a tall, good-looking, wealthy, and hedonistic. He frequented prostitutes of both sexes and probably fixed Schubert up with whomever gave him syphilis. Okay, all right. So the first symptoms of the disease began to manifest themselves in the late fall of 1822. He was working on this symphony. They became more pronounced in January of 1823, and that's when he stopped working on this symphony. Schubert was terrified as the syphilis took hold and began to chart his agonizing course. Periods of remission were followed by periods of painful lymphatic swelling, rashes, hair loss, diseases in the mouth, the throat, debilitating in the muscle, all these terrible, terrible things. Depression and despair accompanied the periods of relapse. So, even though he lived for another 8 years, what kind of mental framework would he have been in to come back to work on this symphony? All he would think about, this is when I found out that I had this disease and I have very limited lifespan left. So, too many bad memories might be associated with it. And like I said, his Ninth Symphony is equal to Beethoven in terms of drama and everything, and in terms of structural innovation, and it's just an incredible symphony. So how sad that this late in life, as he was beginning and reaching this greatest state of maturity, we have several late works that are pretty fantastic and are pulling along and carrying along the legacy of Beethoven, who died in 1827. Schubert was one of the people that actually carried the candle in the funeral profession for Beethoven. Well, okay, so what evidence do we have, does Solomon have? Well, he brings up several things. One of Schubert's friends, Braunfeld, writes in his diary in 1826. He brings up in this entry in his diary the great Benvenuto Cellini. Have any of you ever read the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini? He was several 150 years earlier than that, a sculptor and artist, Italian, and was he working in France? He might have been, I can't remember. But in any case, Benvenuto Cellini was one of the most famous of all creative gay people. He was formally charged and convicted of homosexual behavior. That was a product of the times. So today we're a little more aware of this and think that it's not a disease, it's just the way some people are born. So we're, I think, correctly so, much more tolerant of people that have this kind of a lifestyle. But back then, and even in my lifetimes, it simply wasn't allowed, or in some cases very illegal, to engage in that sort of a behavior. So the reference that we have, Benvenuto Cellini, apparently talked about his boyfriends as young peacocks, and that was a code word. And Braunfeld wrote in his diary, Schubert is out of sorts. He needs young peacocks like Benvenuto Cellini. Oh, really? So if that was a very clear reference to Schubert's preferences, or Schubert, what he was doing, well, okay, then maybe there's something there. Schubert had a young gentleman that he sent a letter with him to introduce him to some people, and so this fellow brings the letter to where he's going, and Schubert writes, I greatly recommend you the bearer of this letter. This is 1819. The student's name was Kahl, K-A-H-L. And he says, I beg you to let him have my bed for the few days he is there. Altogether, I hope you will look after him in the friendliest manner, for he is a jolly, dear fellow. In the spring of 1825, Shellman asked Schubert to remember him to everyone as particularly my darling. Okay. Some of it, too, is that every era has its way of redefining words, or at least how they are used or what they imply. I mean, again, when I was a little boy, to be gay was to be happy, okay? And now that has become, and maybe it was back then, maybe I just was naive and wasn't really aware of it. But now you gotta be careful when you say that word, because it might imply something that you didn't mean it to imply. And I think that's very much the case when we read letters and commentary from the 1820s or the 1860s or even the 1900s, where one man would write to another, I absolutely love you. It didn't necessarily imply any kind of a sexual fascination. It was just that I love who you are a great person, and the things you stand for, and you could say that you love them without any inference of anything further than that. So again, we have to read these letters back in the time that they were written, and it's hard to get into what the use of the words were back then, because we have changed. And so how dare we imply something about someone from the past right into the language that was very common back then, without any other deed or any other secondary meaning to be employed. We have letters and more things about that could imply in our modern way of looking things as this indeed was what that Schubert might have been a homosexual or a gay person. So, and also, you know, it's interesting, of course, we cannot positively say that this was the case for Schubert. We really don't know. And we know, for example, here's an example, that reports of Mozart's and Haydn's and certainly Beethoven's and Brahms' contact with prostitutes, they were always gender specific. The people that he had relationships with were women. So even in the case of Mozart and Haydn, and Mozart being married, if he had other relationships with other women, well, okay, we all know that that's been going on for centuries. And with Beethoven and Brahms, they had contact with prostitutes, but always with female prostitutes, and that has been somewhat documented. Because neither Beethoven nor Brahms ever married, nor did Franz Schubert. So again, bottom line is, who cares? I don't. The bottom line is, I'm going to judge Schubert only, first and only, by the great musical works that he gave us. And whatever happened to this person, we all have problems in our lives, and we all deal with them the best way we can. And if this was a part of Schubert's life, then, well, okay, I'm not going to focus on that. My primary interest in Schubert is the first two movements of this symphony, incredible. The C major symphony, the great C major, a work of absolute genius. So many of the songs, so beautiful, so filled with emotion, so strong, and just great music. That's the criteria for judging Schubert, nothing more. With that in mind, let's take a listen to this proposed last movement, which is from the ballet Rosamunde, the Entr'acte. And we'll hear a version that is not exactly following the Rosamunde music that he used for the play, but has been slightly altered, and I think it tightens it up a little bit better. And let's see if you think that it dramatically works. I find it rather interesting. It's not the Brian Newbold version. It is a different version, and I think it's very, very interesting to hear. So let's listen to it. Here's another proposed completion to the Schubert Unfinished Symphony, still based on the Rosamunde ballet music. You have a chart for the Rosamunde. It's on page 14 of your handout. So here we go. Here's this one right here. It's in B minor. Orchestration is different than the Brian Newbold version, and different than the Schubert Rosamunde. So they played that opening basically twice through. New thinking or a development that doesn't appear in your handout. Maybe a second theme there. Maybe a repeat of the exposition there. Sounds like it. If so, where's the second theme? Let's see what we think. B minor there. That sounds transitional. That must be the second theme. It's a variation of what we have in the Rosamunda at measure 32. In this version, that's a definite second theme, or an F sharp, so it's the proper key, and the transition material out of it, like measure 53. So this would be like a closing section, whereas the Rosamunda is like bar 65. Here sounds more like a closing section. That occurs as theme 3 in the original Rosamunda music. Similar to measure 93. That's moving ahead with the material for measure 93. Yep, that's measure 135, the closing section of the Rosamunda music. That's the equivalent to measure 151. So a development section. Not exactly the same as Rosamunda, but pretty close. In fact, rather close. So that's equivalent to measure 172. Moving forward. That's right there, the same measure 211. With the Woodwind response, that's following. We've heard this material before. It's not exactly the same as the Rosamunda. That's a transition to what would be the second theme in this version, which again is, yeah, we've heard that before. Basically, it's kind of like theme 2. And there's that transition material. 240. So somebody equivalent to 322, is that right? Yeah. There's the second theme. In this version anyway. To a cadence. Three again, like before, played twice. This sounds like it should be a coda coming up. Let's see. Yeah, we're closing section, just like we heard before. To a coda. This is in the original Rosalunda music at 350, version 350. E major. Every time I listen to this version of the completion, I become more convinced of it. This is a pretty good completion. It has a little more drama than I thought. Compare that just for a moment to the actual Rosamunde ballet music, or in this case, the Brian Newbold. And I think what you'll hear, we're stopping and starting. They played in the original A430 tuning. Comes to a stop. Some academic orchestral changing orchestration, which means who plays what. And it kind of stops and starts again. And the changes in the orchestration are so predictable. Woodwinds and brass, back to the strings, and the winds come to a stop. And that's theme 2. Is that the second theme in the original? No, it's not. Still based on the main theme, motive 2X. Was it this beat? It just never gets off the ground. It stops again. Nice build up here. Plays it twice through. Yeah. That's theme 3. But it might be a second theme in the original Rosalunda music. There's theme 3 again. Yeah, that's enough. I think you get the feeling in the Rosamunde version, which Schubert did complete, by the way. That's a completed movement of the entr'acte for the ballet. I think it was a ballet staged by, I can't remember which, of Rosamunde. And again, it doesn't fulfill the symphonic promise to be used as the last movement to the B minor symphony. It just keeps stopping. With Beethoven, it was all about dramatic motion. It was getting from here to there. And late Schubert, at least in his symphonies, it definitely is that. The Rosamunde, again, it might be a sketch, and it was good enough. He said, okay, good, it's just for covering the scene change, so it'll be fine. Maybe it's as simple as that. How dare I try to get into Schubert's mind? I have no idea. But written at about the same time that he was doing what we now know as the Symphony Number 8. So, I don't know, doesn't quite make it. The other elephant in the room for Schubert, not elephant, but the other unknown is his 7th Symphony. The first 6 symphonies were primarily written for those smaller, basically smaller chamber orchestras that could play for those Schubertiads in the big room of a private home. So they're a little bit more delicate, a little bit lighter. And then the 7th symphony, we have pretty much an entire symphony in penciled sketch. And it appears to be somewhat complete with harmony all the way through it. But there is such discussion. Is it really Schubert? Is it really meant to be a symphony? It looks like a symphony, but it doesn't seem to, there's no evidence of it, I think, if I remember correctly, no evidence of it being scored anywhere. So it really doesn't show promise. There are several recordings of it, and they are interesting to listen to. But again, we see more of a transitional nature when we get to this 8th Symphony of Schubert, and then phenomenally so for the 9th Symphony, which was really several steps forward. I know if we give just a little bit of a listen, all I'm going to do for you in just the last few moments, here's a little bit of the second movement of the Schubert 9th Symphony, the great C major. And this is a performance I think from the 1930s. Features a great solo for the oboe. You can tell that it's not, now, there might be a little bit of I was going to say Mozart in there. But in the other movements it's not. It's really definitely more like Beethoven. And this movement is as well. We won't have time to listen to the whole thing. But for larger orchestra, it's a fuller texture. And this was the style that Felix Weingartner was arguing against. It's played way too heavy. That slowdown's not indicated in the score anywhere, but Engelberg did it, and it works. It's lovely. And it seems to be heading toward a nice, gentle ending, and like we saw in the 8th Symphony, something louder, big contrast. Okay, so this is what late Schubert is about. He finally understands Beethoven and knows how to employ it. I think there's a definite comparison. At this point in his life, being diagnosed with that terrifying disease, he now has to face mortality, just like Beethoven had to face the continuous deterioration of his hearing, which created in him the Eroica Symphony, the 3rd Symphony. All of a sudden, music had potential extra musical and autobiographical commentary about the composer's life. Schubert, with what he went through late in life, Beethoven, pretty early in life, with the constant deterioration of his hearing, has something to do with how they write their music. So, bottom line, the 8th Symphony as it stands in 2 movements is a great piece. I think you can add the Weingartner version of the scherzo, and perhaps that other version that we heard of the last movement. You come up with a pretty successful and convincing late Symphony of Schubert. Hope you enjoyed that. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much for joining me, and goodbye for now.